brought back Led Zeppelin, and Led Zeppelin 1 came out in the US in January 12th, 1969. It is currently 14 on Best Ever Albums of the 60s, and 58th overall behind Nirvana's In Utero. So I don't know which album's better, but there you go for placement.
Nirvana's In Utero, because it's one ahead of this.
Yep.
Come on, it's math, Josh.
Led Zeppelin, as I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this band, but I'm still going to give a bio. They formed in London in 1968, and they consist of Robert Plant on vocals, Jimmy Page on guitar, John Paul Jones, not his real name, on bass keyboards, and John Bonham on drums. The band was formed out of the dissolution of the Yardbirds, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Jimmy Page was a member of the Yardbirds, and they had played their final gig in July of 1968 in the UK. However, they still had some Scandinavian dates that had to be played to fulfill obligations or contracts or something. So Page and the bassist of the Yardbirds, Chris Dreja, got permission from the other band members to form a new band and use the name of the Yardbirds to fulfill the remaining dates. Page had wanted Terry Reid initially, or as his first choice, who was a musician who opened for, he seemed like he was around the scene at the time. He opened for the Rolling Stones and Cream, among other bands, but he declined for vocal. He wanted him as the vocalist. Reid then suggested Robert Plant, who eventually accepted. Then, in turn, Plant suggested his former drummer John Bonham in a band that they were in called Band of Joy that was not successful. And then John Paul Jones asked about the bassist position after Dreja, or Dreja, it's spelled Dreja, dropped out to become a photographer. And then Page knew of Jones as well from their session musician days. So two of them had already been session musicians for a long time now, and I think that comes into play when you hear the album. They played, so with the four of them, in place, they played their first time together in August of 1968 in some basement beneath a pub or hall or something like that. They completed their Scandinavian dates with the name as the New Yardbirds, and then they started recording their first album and completed it relatively quickly in about 9 days. But then they received a cease and desist letter saying that they had to change their name since Page was the only one allowed to use the Yardbirds name for the Scandinavian dates. Sounds reasonable to me, especially since the New Yardbirds is a dumb band name. So how did Led Zeppelin get their name? Do you guys know this story? I'm curious before I tell it.
I just think it sounds cool.
No,
Yeah.
I feel like I know it. When you tell it, I'll tell you if it's the story that I am aware of.
I'm sure it's what you're thinking of, but accounts differ. But back in 1966, Keith Moon and John Entwistle of The Who recorded an instrumental with Page, John Paul Jones, and Jeff Beck.
Yep, this is the story I know. Yep,
called Beck's Bolero. So they had discussed the idea of forming a supergroup, but that didn't pan out. That would have been a pretty good supergroup, I think.
Yeah.
Moon or Entwistle allegedly said the band would go over like a lead balloon, jokingly. And then somebody made the joke, more like a Led Zeppelin. And then Page remembered that joke 2 years later and used that for the band name. Then their manager, Peter Grant, suggested they drop the A in lead so people wouldn't pronounce it Lead Zeppelin. And then the balloon was replaced by Zeppelin, which is in part why the Hindenburg is on the cover of their first album. So a little side note about Peter Grant. He was their manager at the tail end of the Yardbirds right before they broke up, and then from Led Zeppelin's beginning all the way until their breakup in 1980. He was considered one of the shrewdest and most ruthless managers in history in terms of protecting the artists and getting them fair compensation and good sweet contracts and things like that. He obtained unprecedented contracts for Led Zeppelin for about $1 million advance from Atlantic Records in November of 1968, which was the biggest deal ever for a new band at the time, especially considering Atlantic had never even heard them and signed them without hearing them. And under the contract, this is a quote, the band had autonomy in deciding when they would release the albums and tour, and they had final say over the contents and design of each album, and they would also decide how to promote each release and which tracks to release as singles. And then they formed their own company, Super Hype, to handle all the publishing rights. So that was all in part of the contract, and I mean, that gives you a lot of control as the band as to how to proceed with things, especially considering, all the other bands that we've talked about. They probably wish they had some of those.
Yeah, everybody else is getting screwed over.
Yeah, exactly.
I think CCR in particular would have liked that contract.
Yeah, yep. So Led Zeppelin started touring the UK as the New Yardbirds on October 4th, 1968, and then they became Led Zeppelin on October 25th of that year. They toured North America December 26th, 1968 to February 16th, 1969, and during this tour, this first album was released while they were touring. They started out as an opening act for other bands during that North American tour for other bands on Atlantic Records label, but eventually they were so good they became the headliner, and some of the bands stopped showing up for the.
Can you imagine like 1968 Led Zeppelin opening up for you? That would be something else.
Yeah, they were.
I put that on my gravestone. Like, Led Zeppelin opened for me.
Yeah.
See, you're thinking of it as like you, but I'm thinking of it as like bands that have some things, and then they listen to that. You hear stories about stuff like that periodically, like, Rush opening for people or Van Halen. You know what I mean? And people just being like, "What the hell?" So, and I imagine it would be very similar.
Right. And then their debut album came out January 12th, 1969. When they were touring in America, as I said, and March 31st in the UK. Atlantic Records had distributed copies of the album to radio stations ahead of time, leading up to the release to build hype for that. The album itself was recorded on September 25th, 1968 at Olympic Studios in London. And Jimmy Page says it took about 36 hours over the course of a few weeks to play and mix and arrange everything. It was completed quickly because they knew the material ahead of time, because it was material that they had played during their Scandinavian tour dates, and they had some past rehearsals as well. And also the fact that Page and the manager Peter Grant paid for the production time themselves out of pocket because they hadn't secured a recording contract yet. The total cost of the recording was £1,782 at the time, which in today's money, I did the inflation calculations and conversions, is $42,300 in today's money. And Page claims he knows the exact amount because he remembers signing the bill for the total cost of covering.
It doesn't sound like a whole lot.
I guess not. I mean, not now. Not
but even back then,
their success. It
seems like it would have been.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the album was produced by Jimmy Page and engineered by his friend Glyn Johns, and the album cover was designed by George Hardy. Just out of curiosity, as a trivia, do you know what other band that we've talked about that George Hardy has designed covers for? Any guesses? No. Yeah,
no.
He did the Dark Side of the Moon cover and Wish You Were Here for Pink Floyd as well. They only released one single off this album, Good Times, Bad Times, and this was one of the first albums to be released in stereo only. Up to this point, it was, as we know, mono and stereo, separate releases. And this album initially received poor reviews, infamously by Rolling Stone, which I could not find an actual copy of the review for that.
That's why you wanted my That's why you wanted my password.
Oh, one of the many reasons I wanted stuff on.
I can't figure it out. I think I might have to. I have a paper copy subscription, but I think I might have to pay extra for the digital copy too.
Okay.
You reached out to the wrong person, because there's actually a website called Bad Rolling Stone Reviews that's like just a running list of terrible Rolling Stone reviews.
Oh, that's good to know.
That I will put up on our Twitter account later this week. And yes, Led Zeppelin 1, Led Zeppelin 2, and Led Zeppelin 3 were all absolutely despised by Rolling Stone.
Yeah,
viscerally by the writers.
Cleaning the stacks, Josh. There you go.
Yeah, they've since backtracked on that. I think they're pretty high on their 500 list. But
well, I should hope so.
However, despite all those reviews, it was commercially successful. It reached number 10 on the Billboard charts and 6 in the UK and number 1 in Spain. And that's the history of the group up to this point. I'm not doing anything after, because we're going to be covering pretty much all their albums, or at least their first 4. And I've heard this album, probably dozens of times. But Matt, what did you think about Led Zeppelin 1?
Thought it kicked ass.
Hell yeah.
I don't know. So Zeppelin for me has always been, it's another one of these bands that's been more of a I never really owned. The only album I ever owned was Led Zeppelin 4, which is probably the most popular one. I would.
It is.
It's got Stairway on it, Yeah. So the majority of the songs that I heard were always in some sort of compilation, greatest hits mix. I think I burned several years, 20 years ago, burned like copies of these, releases that were just basically all the songs just put in different orders and stuff. So I was familiar with a lot of these songs, but not with the album. So, I think that aside from like whatever was on Led Zeppelin 4, I know Kashmir's on Physical Graffiti, but I couldn't tell you what songs were on what albums. So it was kind of a nice surprise to hear, what was on here. Starts off great, good times, bad time. What a great way to enter not just an album but your career, right? Like just that, and it's just a classic
iconic
guitar
opening.
Riff. Yeah, totally. But that's a great single. The other songs that I was really familiar with, like Dazed and Confused, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, Communication Breakdown. I've always liked those songs. I like the bluesier songs. So they have, I think it's almost like, they have covers on here, like the bluesy.
They do.
There's like 2 real blues songs, and it seems like those might have been more covers. And then you've got the instrumental kind of like, they're not quite totally in the J.R.R. Tolkien realm just yet, or at least as much as they go into later on.
Just a tinge of folk,
little hint of that, little of the bongos, and that's, what is it, Black Mountainside gives you a little bit of a, kind of that instrumental kind of feel. And I think my favorite surprise song that I really wasn't that familiar with was the last track, How Many More Times. I really like that riff. It's got a very great groove that gets into. And I really like this. This is just a solid, well-produced. They sound great. Pure rock and roll album. It makes me go, why don't I like Zeppelin more than I do? Or why did I never really get into them? And they've always, Zeppelin for me has always kind of been on the periphery, and it's never been something I've disliked or I've heard like, this isn't good. It's always been like, yeah, it's pretty good, but I never really delved into it, aside from, like I said, from Led Zeppelin 4. But I really like this. I mean, it's a good length. It's got a good amount of variety on here. It's certainly different, I think, and much more polished as far as hard rock goes than maybe some of the other stuff that was coming out at this time, or at least the stuff that I'm aware of. But I really like it. Gotta love Robert Plant's voice. Page's, the musicianship is phenomenal. I mean, I don't know if it gets much better than what all 4 of these guys are doing. They are certainly at the top of their game. Yeah. Amongst, there's a reason why, everybody's still wearing T-shirts of Zeppelin, and they got like I said, they got a great name. It's a great rock and roll name. They have it. They got it all, and this is a great opening record. I am going to be interested to hear the other ones that we're going to be covering and kind of compare them. Yeah. It's definitely some different things that, I think Led Zeppelin 4, I don't want to talk too much about that, but I definitely hear some different things, so you can definitely see the sound evolving as the years go on. But for doing this in what would you say, 68 was this album? 68 or 69?
Yeah, they made it in September 68.
68, yeah. So, I mean... I like it. I love it, really, actually, and I should listen to more Zeppelin, I think. So no complaints from me on this one.
Nice. John, what about you? I know some of your thoughts on Zeppelin, but what did you think of this first album?
It was fascinating because, I always come at Zeppelin when I listen, and I'm considerably more familiar with Led Zeppelin stuff, it sounds like, than Matt was. I'm familiar with the albums. I've listened to them many times. I've listened to them in order. I've always been in the camp that Led Zeppelin is a solid band, but I've never thought of them as like the greatest hard rock band or one of the greatest hard rock bands like a lot of other folks do. That's not to say that I don't like their stuff. It's just sort of a little bit of their reputation overstrips maybe what I heard. But boy, this is why this podcast is fun to do, because when I normally listen to Led Zeppelin, I hear them as the forerunner for lots of music that came after them,
Yes.
like big guitar riffs, blues driven stuff. There were tons of those bands in the 70s, and certainly some of the elements of how Led Zeppelin played their instruments and their stagecraft and the rock and roll lifestyle bled over to everything in the 80s, from the bands that were still touring from the 70s, like Aerosmith and Van Halen and stuff like that, but also hair metal and Guns N' Roses and all kinds of different stuff. It's also a sound that bands don't really sound like this anymore, which is fascinating, because for like 25 years there were nothing but bands, and not just male bands, by the way. There were bands like Heart and stuff, right, that were trying to sound like this, that were female fronted. So I always thought of it that way, like this, they portended it. But now hearing it in the context of the 60s, it's hilarious, because like there's nothing that sounds like Led Zeppelin in the 60s. So when you're listening to it, it was an interesting take, because there's all of these songs that I'm familiar with, and I've heard this album many times, but it felt like a space alien take on rock, because there's just nothing that sounded like this, all the way from the opening riff, track 1, 5 seconds in, Good Times Bad Times, doesn't sound like anything else we've listened to in the 60s, nor does Communication Breakdown, and really Dazed and Confused too doesn't. And those are probably the most well-known songs on this as singles or classic rock staples. There's other songs that are equally as much different than what we've listened to, but that was really my takeaway. Like, here you have the prototypical touring rock band lifestyle band, but sounding as novel in their original times as they probably did in 1968. And because of that, this album, it was already going to get a good rating from me, but it probably bumped up a few more points, because I was able to kind of experience Led Zeppelin in a way that it must have been like when you listened to them in 1968, early 1969. And it must have been similar to what, like, when we listened to the Stooges, it was like, where we, I think I said it seemed like they came in a time capsule from 10 years later, but Zeppelin doesn't feel that much later, but it very much feels of a different time in the same way the Stooges did, but also in a way that you immediately get why they became commercially successfol. I mean, it just, you hear the big guitar parts, the big vocals, the big drums of John Bonham, bass lines that are in the background but are thudding bass lines, and and the songs are long, but I think, and it'll be interesting to talk about other Zeppelin albums, because I think they refine their craft a little bit longer. A lot of the 6-minute songs, like You Shook Me and Dazed and Confused and How Many More Times, I would still argue that at this stage Zeppelin could have shaved 2 or 3 minutes off some of those songs and they would have been stronger songs, but that first 4 or 5 minutes is worth it. So strong thumbs up for me, but that's my initial take. Just big everything, like you'd expect Zeppelin to sound like, but also just very different than anything else released in the 60s, even the late 60s.
Yeah, I agree completely. I really liked hearing this album in the context of the 60s. I mean, this band is so hard compared to, they rock so much harder than a lot of the things we've heard at this point. With the exception of maybe like Hendrix or the Stooges, like you said. They are just kind of on another level, and the other shocking thing to me was how like fully formed right out of the gate they sound. There's none of this like
Agreed.
Trying to figure out your sound or doing a lot of covers. I mean, they do have covers on here, but they make them their own for sure. I mean, I haven't heard these songs outside of them, so they're original enough that They're
think
almost
it's
like originals.
a little bit like the band though, in that these people were like gigging, traveling musicians for a long time, and so
Yes.
they had a level of professionalism that when you threw them in a band, they had already lived a couple lifestyles as musicians, and it just kind of, and they played with other people, so I think it
Yes.
naturally congealed a little quicker.
Yeah, two of them were session musicians for a few years already, but it's also, Page was the oldest, I believe. I'm kind of reading a book right now about them to get some more background info. But I mean, Robert Plant was only 20 years old when this album came out, which is just crazy. I really like their blues interpretation. I'm always going to be a sucker for all the blues rock that we listen to, but they sound different than like the Rolling Stones, who kind of do blues in a different way than they do. It's just a bit harder, I guess, or they're more willing to, I don't know, they play off each other so well, especially Page on the guitar and Robert Plant on the vocals. There's a lot of back and forth in some of the songs, like You Shook Me, and then Page has got some great solos on here as well. I also yeah, go ahead.
They also veer away from that mythological lyrical content, which in later Zeppelin albums can be a little bit ponderous at times.
Yeah.
This is still them sort of writing about base instincts here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the lyrics are simple, but they're effective. I gravitate towards the music on this album. I also like Robert Plant's vocals, like Matt said. I just love how high he can get, and his voice is so strong. And I feel like this is like a new level. He brings so much like sex to rock and roll, and in the way that like Morrison levels of sex, Jim Morrison levels, to rock and roll.
Different though, because it's not like sultry like Morrison. It's like it comes right from the scrotum, Josh.
Yeah.
That's how I would describe his voice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely thrusting in to the forefront.
John, who would you rather bone, Robert Plant or Jim Morrison?
Well, it's just, why have to pick one? You know what I mean? It's the 60s.
And the high production quality, I think I didn't recognize how good of a producer Jimmy Page was on this album before listening to it for the review. So yeah, I went through a Led Zeppelin phase in college where I was listening to them all the time and had most of their albums, I think. But it's nice coming to this from a different perspective and with all of the context around it and all the other music that we've heard. So yeah, big thumbs up for me also.
Yeah, I think there's a confidence and there's a maturity with this record, particularly knowing that it's a debut album. And it comes right out. They know exactly what they're doing. I think, Josh, you put it a good way that they didn't really need to find themselves. They knew exactly what they were doing. And I think, John, you make a good point too about listening to this in the context of what we're doing with the podcast, of all the other stuff that we've listened to. And I think that there might be some benefit there that it's taken this long to get to a Zeppelin album, that we've done so many other different types of things. And then this just kind of kicks in and you're like, whoa. It's like it definitely stands out in that regard as well. And I think that there's like proggy stuff in here. Like Babe, I'm Gonna Lose You I love that song. That might be one of my favorite ones on this, with the kind of like the acoustic, and then they kick into the rocking part later on, and they do different things. And I know, John, you're not as a fan of the longer songs. I'm okay with that. If the song is great, and maybe you're trying to do different things, I don't mind a long song at all, if it's done right. But I also think it's interesting how, you're talking about nobody else sounds like this, but there is, like, if you heard Greta Van Fleet, they're trying to do exactly this.
No. Tons of people sound like this. No one sounded like this in 1960.
No, right.
Yeah,
right.
That's
okay,
the key, because everybody for a while sounded like Led Zeppelin afterwards.
But that's a band now that's really trying to sound like Led Zeppelin. But and there's also, have you guys ever heard of Les Zeppelin?
Yes, I have.
The female Led Zeppelin cover band, Les Zeppelin. So I think I saw them at Bonnaroo once. They were pretty good. Yeah, this is great, man. And I think I'm going to like more as it comes along. I think I'm going to really get more into Zeppelin. And I don't know why I didn't really feel them more in previous years. It just didn't hit me. I think sometimes that happens. But John, would you say, because you're a little surprised by how much you like this compared to what you knew about it from before, did you just not feel that it was as good as people were making it out to be, or you thought that they were overrated? Like, what was your hesitancy with that?
I don't think Led Zeppelin's necessarily overrated, and I want to start by saying Led Zeppelin 1's always been one of my 2 or 3 favorite Led Zeppelin albums. I think where my difference of opinion comes on some of the mid-career Zeppelin stuff that I am a little bit more hit and miss on, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. This one, the straight ahead nature of it is actually a plus for me. I like Led Zeppelin when they sound like this more. But to answer your question, like, are you asking me, like, why have I not connected? I think the reason is because so many bands did Led Zeppelin later, and I listened to them concurrently with when I was listening to Led Zeppelin, that I did not get to experience them in chronological order, you know what I mean? So there were other people that I think took a little bit of what Zeppelin did and tweaked it in a way that I liked a little bit better.
Gotcha. Okay.
If that makes sense. But like I said, hearing it in the context of where it was, I had an appreciation, but it really gives you a sonic appreciation for the time frame of, and we've talked about that before. In many ways, I feel like this was the first album from the 1970s that we've listened to in the 1960s. It feels like an album that was from the 1970s. Like the only other ones I'd say that kind of I got that vibe from was like the Stooges album, really. And so that was, it's a compliment I can give it, is that it sounds outside of its time.
I mean, I've always thought of Zeppelin as being a 70s band, So
well, and they really are in terms of
right.
And their sonic footprint is all over the 70s. It's kind of like, is Pink Floyd a 60s band or a 70s band? They're really a 70s band. But,
Yeah. Also, one final point I had was how good John Bonham was on drums in this album. He just
plays really, really loud. He's a very talented drummer. I think John Bonham's an excellent drummer, but I think that, a lot of what people love about him is just how loud he plays. And that's, that always comes through on Led Zeppelin albums.
Can I just go back to the whole reviewing thing? So Rolling Stone, right? They've been notorious for, giving bad reviews, obviously from the website that John was talking about, particularly with Led Zeppelin. So somebody does the review, right? Like at a magazine or a publication. So one person listens to the album, does the review, but does that have to go through like an editorial board? It can't just be one person's. Like Jan Wenner had to approve all of the, or like a series of people. It's not just based on one person, right? When you say Rolling Stone does the review, you're not just saying Lester Bangs is doing the review if he's the reviewer, So like, I wonder if that's like, what the process for that is, and maybe it varies from one magazine or publication to the next, but I'm just kind of curious about that as we're talking about it. Like, who really made that decision? Who really was the one that said, or was it everybody? Did everybody really at Rolling Stone hate it, or were there some people that were dissenters that got overruled? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question.
It's hard for me to say because I've never been a person that is directed to my music from critic reviews. I think just even from an early age realized that, the only way to judge an album, right, is do you like it or not? And so, and I would assume you're going to pick people that have a similar, especially back then when there weren't people sitting in that room making sure that there was representative viewpoints in that room. It's very much the same room for the most part.
Well, the most benefit that I ever got out of reviews was, if you like this, then you might like this, right? Like, so this band sounds like this, or they have elements of that you can kind of get a comparison to other stuff that you might know. I found that to be helpful. And I've also found it just if artists say, oh, I'm really into this, like an artist that like that's how I found out about Wolf Parade. Like, Win Butler from Arcade Fire was talking about it. I was like, oh, that's interesting. But as far as reviews go, I think, comparing other records is where I get the most out of that. But, it's interesting how these things look in hindsight, and how other, did the person that panned it really, do they still hate it, or are they sticking to their guns, or have they come around now, So I think we can all change our minds.
Yeah, being provocative and having a strong viewpoint sells magazines too, especially back then. So, but yeah, that's Led Zeppelin, the start of our Led Zeppelin journey. But continuing on the Beatles journey, now we've got Matt